Hello, I'm Maura Kenny, and I'm delighted to be here with you today at the Myrtle Beach Art Museum and to show you my body of work entitled Where the Rivers Flow. As a painter, I have been painting for over 50 years, started out as an oil painter, and have worked in watercolor and mixed media exclusively in the last 10 years. The Waccamaw Neck is a stretch of land that is surrounded by water. The Atlantic Ocean to the east, Winyah Bay to the south, and the river system to the west. It is a land very rich in culture and history. It's beautiful. It's part of the low country of South Carolina. And I've been very grateful to be a resident of the Waccamaw Neck for the last 40 years. The beauty of the Waccamaw Neck has been my main inspiration for this body of work. Landscapes done on the river, on the land, in historic areas. People who live, work, and recreate on the rivers have all become part of my subject matter as I try to encapture in this body of work life here on the Waccamaw Neck. It's another world, and I'd like to bring you into that world through this exhibit. In this first gallery of paintings, I'm introducing you to the scenes along the Waccamaw and Petey rivers. In this particular painting, I have an aerial perspective of the Waccamaw and Petey river systems in relation to the South Carolina coast. In the painting, this vascular-like appearing squiggle is representative of the river system itself. Technically, in order to maintain that light value system of the rivers, it was necessary for me to mask out or block, similar to a batik artist does, those areas that I want to remain light or white. So by using a masket pen, I was able to actually draw the river system with the masket pen, let the masket dry, and once that was dry, I was free to wet the paper, apply wet washes of color, violets, greens, blues, golds, and so forth. And then while that paint was still wet, throwing kosher salt into the wash to create the textured topography of the land that you see between and around the rivers. In terms of placement, the Waccamaw River is this river that follows just parallel to the coast. The Petey River runs on the other side of this heart shape, which is actually Sandy Island. It's bordered on the north by Bull Creek and on the south by Thoroughfare Creek. If you'll notice, I painted the rivers a tan color, and there's a reason for that. The actual local color of the rivers is tan, and I wanted to represent that natural aspect to the water in this painting. We talked about the river system here being a black water system. The display in front of you shows a variety of values of color from water near and around the Waccamaw Neck. You can see that the clearest color It comes from the Atlantic Ocean. Next, you'll see Winyah Bay with the color being slightly tinted tan, and the reason for that is because of the decomposition of leaves and pine needles that stains the water a tea color. That color continues to get darker as we go into the salt marsh system, which is near a forest system where that forest drainage creates a deeper value of tannin in the water. So that river system has the tan brownish color because of decomposition, but it also reflects atmospheric qualities when doing a painting. If you're looking at a river scene at sunset, sunrise, or even on a foggy day, the color of the water is going to absorb the sky and surrounding terrain, and the water becomes that color. Local color is stained by tannin. Atmospheric color is affected by the environment surrounding it. We talked about the local color of the Waccamaw River as being tan. In this painting, there's an example of atmospheric color. In the sky, you see the salmon pinks and violets of the sun going down at sunset, and that is reflected in the water of the Waccamaw River. So that surface is like a mirror, taking on the colors that are above it and surrounding it, the teal greens and blues from the landscape, the rose and violets from the sky, and the atmosphere is being reflected back in that surface color. With this painting of Chicora Wood Plantation, which sits on the banks of the Petey River, I'd like to point out some technical applications of watercolor washes that you'll see throughout the exhibit. To show a soft, kind of muted application of color, I've used a wet-on-wet technique for the sky and for the water. You wet the paper, saturate the paper, drop your color in, and pretty much let it diffuse so that you get that soft application, distant appearance of the trees against the sky in the background. That same technique has been used in the foreground for the water surface. And again, the water area was saturated with water, and while wet, colors reflecting colors in the landscape were dropped into that wet paper so that that soft, flowy appearance of the water surface creates the reflection effect. In opposition to that wet-on-wet application, oftentimes a watercolor painter needs full control of where his paintbrush is going. And in this case, I have reserved areas of dry paper so that I can come in and approach the painting of the rice barn with full control to give it texture, to paint some of the smaller details of the barn, and to create a focal area so that the eye immediately goes to that rice barn and then dissipates out with the landscape and the reflections as the viewer moves his eyes around the composition. And in some paintings, you'll see a combination of both wet and dry techniques used one on top of the other. So the wet-on-wet application that we talked about for the distant trees was made. It was let dry, and then once that was dry, I went in and started to paint the negative space between the trees. So the light bark of the trees is actually the color of that first application of light green. That darker shade drops the space back between the trees, and you have the pop of the tree trunks created through the use of both of the techniques just described. In this painting, we have an image of a rice trunk gate along the Petey River. These rice trunk gates were used during the plantation era to affect the flow of water over the rice fields for rice growth. Nowadays, plantation owners and DNR use those same rice trunk gate mechanisms to manage waterfowl. I also wanted to point out the fact that in this painting we have atmospheric color, but we also have an addition to the atmospheric color of the water as it absorbs the environment colors around it and throws them back out at the viewer. We also have the force of wind causing ripples on the surface of the water. And those ripples create a pattern of dark and light value colors. So in creating this painting, I had to think ahead of time of how I was going to manage that element successfully. So using wet on dry application in some places of the water surface. In other places, I had to use wet on wet by dropping wash into already wet paper and then tilting the board in a variety of directions to get this circular motion going. And then while still wet, I had to drop salt into it to get the specks of variation of value. And then when all of that dried, I went back in with the darker value color of linear application and curved lines to create the darker ripples on the water surface. In the second gallery, many of my paintings feature Sandy Island. Sandy Island is a very unique place. This island is a 12,000 acre wildlife refuge with a small community of people from the Gullah Geechee heritage that are descendants of former slaves who worked the rice fields on Sandy Island. In this painting, I'd like you to imagine you're in a boat, you're leaving Sandy Island Landing, and we're in a channel where cypress trees line one side of the channel, Brookring Gardens is on the other side of the channel, and we're traveling out to the Waccamaw River, and in front of us is Sandy Island Village, which is known as Mount Arena, meaning Sand Mountain. In the painting, as we're traveling through this channel from the Sandy Island landing, the water changes color. It goes from that very highly tannin color of tan out to the flow of the Waccamaw River where it turns more blue. And the people who live in Sandy Island Village, they reside on the only dock on the island, and that dock is their way of tying up their boats and getting back and forth from the island itself to the mainland. The beautiful people of Sandy Island, the gorgeous topography and landscape, and plethora of wildlife have really been an inspiration for me as an artist, and I think you'll see that in several of the paintings that we're about to look at. In addition to landscape painting, I love painting portraits. In this painting, Laura Harriet, proprietor of Winyah Cottage, who lives on Sandy Island, is greeting guests as they approach her cottage for a celebration where inside she has a table laid out with her southern cooking and special blend of iced tea. Laura is a very active member of the Gullah community on Sandy Island, and she has given us a tour of the church where she also is very involved. She's talked to us about the schoolhouse on Sandy Island. She has her business of Winyah Cottage, and the name, she told us, of the cottage is a combination of both her grandfather, William, and her grandmother, Mary's first names. What I really like about this painting is the way the light hits not only the figure of Laura, but the fence, and how some of the leaves in the tree above are either lit up by the filtered light or darkened by the shadow that they're in. And I think this play of light throughout the painting is an aspect of the work that gave me great pleasure as I was painting it, and very exciting, actually, to try to move that light in a way that would become of interest to others. Childhood is a collection of memories, memories that sustain us. In this painting, we see Laura Harriet's granddaughter, Candace, visiting her at Winyah Cottage. Laura's grandchildren often visit and sometimes will spend a whole summer with her. In this particular painting, I was very interested in showing light and shadow. So you can see the evidence of shadow from the trees above against the cottage itself. You can also see the way the vegetation surrounding the cottage lightens up in some places, and that pattern of light and shadow carries through the painting. In the painting, you also see the green gate, which is the opening up into Winyah Cottage. That green is a color of youth and vitality, and the gate itself is a symbol of protection. Knowing where you come from is such a good boost for confidence in any person. Candace has well been introduced to where she comes from. So where do the rivers flow? The rivers flow into Winyah Bay estuary, and the paintings behind me show the North Island Lighthouse sitting right at the mouth of Winyah Bay. The lighthouse is over 200 years old, the oldest lighthouse in the state, and in the paintings you'll see that the close-up view of the painting to my right shows a technique of wet on dry paint so that the controlled ripples and waves of Winyah Bay are quite distinct, whereas the painting on the left, where the perspective is further away from the lighthouse, you see more of the water. And in this painting, that wet on wet technique that we talked about earlier is being used to soften the water surface in the painting. Winyah Bay also hosts opportunities for eco-touring and historic tours, and for recreating. In this particular painting, we were taking a boatload of nephews and nieces out on Winyah Bay for a pleasure cruise. One of the aspects of this painting that really moved me was the interaction of the two figures, my two nephews, who are sitting side by side, and the actual warmness of the color of the body closest to me, where the figure of the other young man is in shadow and takes on a bluish cast. I found that quite enamoring and almost echoes the kind of quality of the warms and cools in the landscape behind it. Also featured in my exhibit are paintings from Hobcaw Barony. Hobcaw, meaning land between the waters, is a 16,000-acre wildlife refuge at the southernmost tip of the Waccamaw Neck. There are 70 historic sites on the property that are in the National Registry of Historic Places. A king tide is an especially high tide that's affected by the moon, the sun, and the rotation of the earth. In this painting, we're seeing the evidence of a king tide down on Hobcaw Barony. I'd like to talk a little bit about how this painting came to be. Before adding any of the landmass in the painting, the dark areas that you're seeing as the sun is going down, I'd like to talk about the fact that the sky, which was yellow and violet and orange, was painted from the top of the picture plane right on down to the bottom. So that first layer of wet on wet color was all orange, yellow, and violet. Once that was dry, I then came back with grays and blacks to create the landmass. This is Goat Island, and the trees are black and dark gray. And since it's darker than the sky colors in watercolor painting, you can paint dark over light. Light over dark does not work. So I continued with the grays so that the Spartina grass is reflected in the water surface. And in the foreground, a contrast of very dark blades of Spartina against the light valued colors of the water make that grass pop forward and add to the dimension of space within the picture plane. In early spring on Hobcaw, a fire prevention activity takes place. It's known as the controlled burn. This controlled burn burns off any of the dried grasses and debris from the previous year so that the next summer will not ignite any fires. One of the things that really piqued my interest as I was driving down Crab Hall Road, where I viewed this particular scene, was that there was this, out of the ashes of the controlled burn came the new spring colors and light at the top of the longleaf pine forest. So I stopped and took many photographs, worked for several months on this painting. And when I got the trees and the spatial applications completed, my last task was to show the smoke, not the smoke of a wildfire, but the smoke of a smoldering burn the day after the activity took place. In trying to figure out how to approach this particular phenomena, I thought about several different ways to create the illusion of smoke. What I came up with that seemed to work was to, first of all, go back to where the dark shadows in the forest were and try scrubbing some of that color out so that it softened and created a haze underneath the trees. I stood back, wasn't strong enough, didn't look like smoke, but it did look hazy. So I came back on top of that with some Chinese white paint, wet the area that I had just scrubbed out, dropped in that Chinese white, and then immediately took a paper towel and brushed it in a direction that would look like smoke in a breeze. And that was done in each section along the forest bottom as you travel through the painting. There's another painting in this gallery that uses this same technique, but for showing steam coming out of a pot of oysters being cooked. So we're going to look at that painting next. Oyster roasts are a beloved activity here in the Low Country during the fall and winter months. In this painting, we're going to talk about the smoke coming out of the pot of steamed oysters. To achieve that steamy effect, again, the dark background had to be lifted out to create a haze. And then once that haze was established, I went back in with Chinese white to establish that smoke closest to the pot with the most contrast being exhibited. So you have that same technique used in the controlled burn being repurposed in the steam coming off the oysters. While we're talking about oysters, a very exciting activity for most people is to collect their own. In this particular painting, we're looking at oysters that are being gathered in the salt marshes of the Low Country coast. And technically, oysters were a challenge. How do you paint masses of oysters and pull them off as believable? In this case, the oysters that you see on the banks of the creek were created by dropping wet washes of grays and tans into already established wet areas, throwing salt on top of that wet on wet wash, letting it dry, and then coming back in and painting the space between the oysters. In other words, the oysters were there. What I had to do is make them more distinctive by painting the darker, sharp edges that you see surrounding the oysters. Another challenge to this painting was painting the transparency of the aquacolor water over some of the oysters on the floor, on the salt marsh floor. So following through with a similar process that I just explained on the bank, I went ahead and painted in the oysters on the creek floor and then washed over those oysters with aqua blue to give it that transparent quality. And once that was done and dry, lifted up the pattern of ripples that I was seeing in terms of the flow of the water. The next three paintings are paintings from Friendfield Village on Hobcaw Barony. These paintings encompass the past with the present. The painting in the center is a painting of Friendfield Village Church as it can be seen today. And as I saw when I was down in the village, plein air painting, which means painting on location. And in order to establish its connection with the past, finding some archival photographs of a wedding that took place in this chapel back in the 1920s became my way to connect with that past history. For the wedding party itself, the painting of the figures was done on a Yupo transparent paper, which is a polystyrene paper. And I painted just the shadow shapes in order to leave blank the transparent paper to create a ghost-like image. The paintings were then cut out and stitched onto the background chapel, thus connecting the past with the present. In this painting, the same process was used again in Friendfield Village, with the plantation era woman being painted on Yupo and sewn into the middle of the cabins that faced Main Street, Friendfield Village. In the singular cabin, the woman was also painted using the same technique on the Yupo paper. Shadow shapes only were addressed with color and some wet on wet to let some of the colors run, leaving the light side of the figure open to being able to see through it for that ghost-like transparency. Friendfield Village is a beautiful spot to paint for painters. The light that hits that village area is very exciting and very stimulating for anyone wishing to use color in their work. I would like to thank the Myrtle Beach Art Museum and its wonderful staff for the support they've given me and the opportunity to show my work. I'd also like to thank, and I'm very grateful for the sponsorship of Bank of America for producing this video and for supporting its art and artists in the state of South Carolina.